Good evening, sir.
Good
Now
evening.
that now that we are beginning formally, um, this interview, this interaction is being organized by the Probe, which is a non-profit, student-run, independent monthly magazine published by Caucus. That's a student organization of Hindu College. Caucus was formed in 2007, and after 13 years of progressing policy talks, discussions, and deliberations, in 2020 we started our magazine, The Probe. And the basic aim is to create an alternate niche wherein students can get together to discuss issues of broader concern and to be able to interact and express themselves. So it's indeed a matter of great honor and privilege for us to be interacting with you. And I might say a bit of a fanboy moment for all of us who have read and will
Okay.
continue to read your works. So thank you so much, sir, for being with us. I
Thank
would
you. Thank you very much. And I'm very glad to hear that, an organization you have created has lasted that long. And it's looking like being very durable. So it's wonderful that you have a platform organized by students for students, uh, which is wonderful. And I, of course, have an old association with Hindu College as a teacher in the late 60s. Before I came to JNU, I was teaching in Hindu College along with legendary teachers like Professor Bipin Chandra and Professor Dashat Sharma. And there used to be one Professor Kotyal of ancient Indian history. So yes, I have a very old association and very fond memory of Hindu College. So thank you very much for inviting me to this. Yes.
so sir, I would now like to ask Rijul to begin asking the set of questions that we have prepared for today. Rijul, please take over.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So, I'd like to begin with a bit of a question regarding as to why you began with the study of history. As in, what was it that uh, piqued your interest in pursuing history per se, and not some other discipline from the social sciences?
there, there wasn't any particular reason why I came to history. One, you might be surprised to know that I did my high schooling from Bihar. There is a coal town called Jharia there in Bihar. Is it still in Bihar? Probably it's gone to Jharkhand. I'm not very sure. But anyway, it was a coal town in Bihar. And from a school in that uh, coal town of Jharia, I did my schooling. Uh, and in schooling, there was no science. In fact, we had in the school one celebrated science teacher, mathematics teacher actually. So nobody knew his name. He was famous as a BSc teacher. So he was a celebrated teacher for being a BSc who was teaching mathematics. I, did my schooling from that kind of school. And in Jharia, luckily, that year there was no college. Next year a college opened, but that year there was no college. So I had to go somewhere. So nearest I could go to was BHU, Banaras. For it was used to be called intermediate, between school and college. Intermediate. I did my intermediate from there, BHU, where uh, for no particular rhyme, there was nobody at home to guide me. So for no particular reason, uh, I just joined history. In any case, I had very little choice anyway. So I could have history and civics, I think, and Hindi and English, etc. So then I got a little interested in history in BHU in the intermediate level. Uh, there used to be one Professor Tilochan Pant, good history teacher. I still remember him. So he created a bit of interest. Then, after intermediate, I came over to Delhi uh, for uh, uh, for uh, for BA for graduation. I got admission to the college which had just started that year in 1956, I think. Uh, it had just moved to campus, namely Karodimal College. I got admission there. Uh, my marks in intermediate were okay, average, kind of slightly above average, nothing spectacular. But I got admission because it was a new college, and that at that time one didn't have six nineties and 80s score of 90s and 80s and so on. 50s was good enough, so I got admission there. That changed my life completely, almost. There I met my guru, Dr. K.M. Ashraf, the celebrated historian. He's a great historian and a great man, great teacher. Uh, so he genuinely created a lot of interest in the subject beyond, passing exams and so on and so forth. And I had heard of doing IES and so on and so forth, but under Dr. Ashraf's influence, I completely forgot all about IES and so on. And after BA, I did my MA from Delhi University and got a teaching job in the same college, Karodimal College. Started teaching there. So it was kind of, there was no particular reason. You asked me why. There was no particular reason I could. It was just accidents. I had very little else to do, so I went over, and then I got interested. Actually, got interested in history, and I really began to feel that history has a role to play in society. History has a Historians have something to contribute to society, in terms of changing its way of thinking. Influence, not changing perhaps, or maybe changing, influencing its way of thinking about the past, thinking about the present and future, and so on. So I realized that as a historian, one is not merely a teacher of history who is influencing students, but has a larger role in society. So I'm sorry, very long-winded answer to a very short question. But as I said, I didn't have, I can't, there is no particular route I followed to history. It was just by accident that I came into the discipline, and then I began to like it, and I stuck with it. And I'm still sort of sticking with it in my 80s. Yes. What's your next
Uh,
question?
so yeah, moving along the same lines, it's a similar question. So,
Okay.
for the past half a century, you have been one of the most prominent voices in historic writing, and your work has been very influential. So, uh, how do you reflect upon how your career has been and how that has shaped in the evolution of history? And also, is there a particular reason why you gravitated towards medieval India and early medieval India, where most of your works revolve around?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, the last 50 years or so, well, thank you very much for rating my work so highly. But I don't, I'm happy to hear that, though I don't agree with you. But anyway, thank you. But yeah, in the last 50 years, 60 years, everything has changed. History has changed enormously. It's a different world altogether, world of history. The kind of history I studied at BA and MA was, dynastic history, wars, battles, enthronement, dethronement, and so on, administration, this policy, that policy of that ruler, and so on and so forth, rather boring. Uh, but the kind of history that you people are studying, the kind of history that we ended up in the last, well, I've retired 20 years ago, but in the last 10, last at JNU, for example, the kind of history that, or even we started earlier, but at JNU, the kind of history that we started teaching was a very different kind of history altogether, in the sense that the themes were different, the themes were much larger than this battle and that policy and so on and so forth. But they comprehended society, social change, societal change over a long period of time. Uh, like uh, uh, at JNU, professor, you could specialize in ancient, medieval, and modern. But all of the students had to do 4 courses compulsorily, irrespective of their specialization. Uh, uh, One was ancient society, which Romila Thapar was teaching. She had devised that. We had all devised these courses because we were ourselves new to these courses. We had ourselves studied these kinds of courses, as I mentioned, but we wanted to do something which we hadn't done ourselves either as students or as teachers. So we were devising new courses. So ancient society, not ancient society of India or China or Greece or anything, ancient society around the world. What was what was so ancient about this society? What were the characteristics of being an ancient society? It was followed by a course called feudalism, which fell to my lot to teach, which I had no notion about prior to its falling to my lot. But I tried to develop a whole kind of understanding of feudalism the history of feudalism as it evolved in Europe and by comparison in other areas, particularly India. So, while teaching feudalism to students, a kind of comparative history began to develop, began to evolve on its own, almost on its own. And therefore you would have had to read my our debate, feudalism debate, Professor Sharma, and so on. Or the third course was capitalism and colonialism, which Bipin Chandra and S. Bhattacharya were teaching. And there was a fourth course called historical method, which initially the whole faculty was lecturing to poor students. And the whole faculty also used to attend each other's lectures. So, the area, and then areas began to expand phenomenally, things like the history of disease, for example, the history of treatment of diseases, the histories of concepts of time and space, the histories of uh, concept of history itself, and so on. So, and history, then gradually history of women came in, history of gender relations came in. It began to develop, and history of environment, ecology, history of forests and deserts and rivers and so on. All of these fantastic kinds of history of social relations, history of interpersonal relations, history of habitat. All of these new kinds of phenomenally new kinds of themes began to develop. So that the kind of history, as I said, studied as I said, I studied history of dynasties and their rules and administrative policies and so on, and the kind of history that began to develop, evolve in the next 50 years or so, 50, 60 years. It's a different world altogether. And you people are very, very lucky to be reading, to doing this kind of history, rather than our kind of history that was, which ruler killed whom and how many battles he fought and so on. The kind of history that gave bad name to the discipline, so many dates and names to remember. The kind of history that you have to study today, you don't have to remember dates and names and so on and so forth. You grapple with ideas and social concepts and social behavior rather than, who killed how many horses in which what battle and so on and so forth. Now, you had asked me how did I come to medieval India. Well, very largely because my teacher, my guru, Dr. Ashraf, was influential in that. He was a great teacher, and therefore, his ideas had great influence on most of us who were his students. So if I had to, and one had to choose very strictly between, if you did ancient India, you knew nothing about medieval or modern India. If you choose medieval India, there was no way you could get anything, get to know anything of ancient or modern India, and so on and so forth. Very strict kind of divisions, which are broken down now, fortunately. So that I was drawn to medieval India very largely because of the influence of Dr. Ashraf. But also I found it very interesting in the sense that uh, society was changing very, very dramatically in the medieval centuries in India. In every aspect of society, there was change, very fascinating change. Whether it is society or it is ideas or it is statecraft or it is technology, economy, everything was changing, And change is what history is all about. So you study change in history. So yes, I started off as a student of that kind of dynasty kind of history, but ended up, I think, it's far more fascinating, vaster area of history than this dynastic history had constricted us to. Yes.
All right, sir. So the next question has kind of been answered, but still to gloss over it once. It's to do with the creation of Center for Historic Studies at
Okay.
JNU. So that how it has played a very major part in how historical discourse has moved forward. Do you have any particular reflections on the same as to how the
Yes,
CHS has?
indeed. Indeed, yes. It's a question still worth exploring. Uh, uh, I had started teaching in 1960 in Karodimal College, and I taught at three colleges of Delhi University, Karodimal, then Rajdhani College, and then Hindu College, about 3.5, 4 years. Uh, and this was late in the 1960s, early 70s, late 60s. I think in about 1967, I think 67, 68, there was a great deal of, a kind of wave of change had occurred in India. And the change was most visible in the political arena, in the arena of voting. In 1967, Uh, the Congress party, which had ruled for the last 20 years, was voted out from all the states in India, in North India, as it used to be said, from Punjab to West Bengal. It was wiped out in the states. It remained in place in Delhi, in the center, but in the states it was voted out. And interestingly, the the issue on which it was voted out was price rise. And if I may tell you an anecdote, this price rise, the issue, it became a big issue from a very minor, minor price rise, Um, I think there is one in Connaught Place. There is this. What market is it called? Which is covered underground kind of market. No, not municipal, or it's anyway. There used to be a coffee house in the open, and where this market is now. It's a government's market, I think, or no. Anyway, sorry, forgive me. Uh, it used to be a coffee house, open coffee house. There used to be a cooperative coffee house stall, and Delhi's journalists and teachers and intelligentsia, as it was called, and intellectuals used to go and have coffee there. And I think it used to cost 4 annas. We were still in the anna 4 anna stage, and suddenly the one day the price rose to from 4 to 5 anna or 6 anna, you know. And then the Delhi's sort of journalists and intelligentsia and intellectuals, they were up in they were up in arms, against this price rise. And then they formed a price rise resistant movement, PRRM. I remember that, PRRM, price rise resistant movement. And suddenly it caught on, this PRRM caught on, social fancy, and it became a movement and became a powerful enough to throw out the governments from Punjab to West Bengal, and so the anger, actually, it caught on the social anger which was brewing, not only because of the coffee, but obviously general price rise, so it caught on that, and therefore the government. So it was a kind of, suddenly, suddenly there was a change in the offering. Things were changing, and we were being realized that you can change things. If you can do this price resistant movement, if you can change governments, you can change lots of things. So there was a lot of what shall I say, enthusiasm, lot of optimism in the air, lot of craving for change occurred. It was at that stage that some of us, three of us to be exact, or let me say 2.5 of us in Delhi University, Romila Thapar, who was teaching in the department of history, Bipin Chandra and I were in Hindu college. So Romila Thapar one, Bipin Chandra another, and I was a half. We 2.5 of us thought of, probably influenced by this, atmosphere of change. We thought of changing the history syllabus in the Delhi University courses, We thought that the history syllabus was given to us by colonial regime and it was still continuing. And therefore, this was about 20 years after independence, So it's time that history syllabus was recast altogether. So we also started a movement in Delhi University among the history teachers of Delhi University. And history teachers doesn't mean merely university department teachers, but also college teachers, which used to be called college council, I think it used to be called, or something, which included teachers of the subject in all colleges. So we moved there. We thought our proposal will be received with great enthusiasm. But we realized that the enthusiasm was completely missing. Nobody wanted to change. In fact, there was a great resistance to change. Why should we change? We were asked. We are doing quite well. Our students are doing quite well. What is the need for change? So this was the kind of background, where we failed in bringing around any change on the in the syllabus of Delhi University's history department. So then suddenly JNU came along in 19. It was established in 1916. I mean, established means the act was passed in 1969. It started uh, taking shape in 1970 and 71 and so on. So that's when JNU came along. And there we realized that this was a clean slate. All that we wanted to do in Delhi University, we could do it there. You see, we didn't have to face any resistance because we would all be sort of new there, and there is no baggage we'll be. I mean, some baggage we'll be carrying that we our own baggage, but we were all determined to see that this baggage is abandoned, and we would start on a clean slate altogether and create new kinds of courses, or not merely courses but also teaching methods. I mean, our main emphasis was on tutorials, not the kind of tutorials that we did in the colleges of Delhi University, which is purely formal. But tutorial is every student is asked to write a tutorial on a theme. Three or four themes are given to them to pick up one theme. Reading list is given to write a tutorial, present it to the class, to a small group in the class. The classes were small anyway, but they were divided into tutorial groups, each one of three or four students. And each one was asked to present his or her tutorial, and others were asked to question and discuss and question and argue and examine and scrutinize the tutorial. And the student presenting it had to answer these. And the teacher there sat with a benign smile on his or her face, not interfering too much. The idea was two ideas. One is that you have to learn history by yourself. Classes were just 2 hours of teaching in a course in a week. The rest of the time was so structured that students spend most of their time not in the classroom but in the library. And they are not given they are not given something ready made in the class. They have to find their own sources, their own arguments. They create their own formulate their own argument and present them, and argue with others and defend their own argument and so on and so forth. So as a result, one that uh, we teachers were innovating courses which we hadn't done ourselves or even taught ourselves. So these are new courses. They were short courses, usually for I should have mentioned, we also experimented with genuine semester system. Each semester you had, I think, 4 courses in a semester, and it ended with the semester. It didn't carry on till the examination was partly the examination was almost every 10 days there was an exam, because the tutorial that you wrote and presented to the class, to your tutorial group, each tutorial carried 1/4 of the grade. So 2 tutorials in a course, in each course, and half your grade is done, and the other half is at end semester exam. Which is unlike the annual exam. In annual exam we have passed through that system. In annual exam, you prepare about 10 questions. You avoid the questions which appeared last year because they were unlikely to appear again. So you have about 15 odd 16, 18 questions, of which you avoid about 10 or 8 or 10 which appeared last year. So you are left with about 8 or 10 questions. You have to prepare these 8 or 10 questions for each paper, and then you don't have to, you don't have to study throughout the year. You only need to study for the, in the month of January, February, March before you appear in the exam. Annual exam. Annual exam has that disadvantage. I'll tell you a wonderful story which illustrates this point. That I when in Hindu college, I was also teaching in the university. I was asked to teach in the Department of History. So I was teaching there, and there was one very bright student. He was very bright. I liked him very much because he used to ask lots of good questions. He was very critical to ask very good questions. Throughout about September, October, November, he was very regular in the class. Then came January, and he started absenting himself from the class. So one day I ran into him on the street and I said, "Hello, so and so, why are you not coming to the class these days?" So he gave me a fantastic answer. He said, "Sir, now I've started studying seriously," he said. So, so you study seriously only in January, February, and prior to that, you're just having fun in the class, asking questions and so on. So, that's structured into annual exam. It's not about a particular university or something. If you have an annual exam, it doesn't require you to study throughout. We had created the system where every 10 years you are writing every 10 days you are writing a tutorial, presenting it, and defending it and so on, and it's being evaluated. So you are appearing in an exam every 10 days, as it were. So that you are constantly studying, constantly preparing for the exam, as it were, constantly studying and creating your own argument. So in a way, it was delightful because both teachers were uh, evolving as teachers. All of these courses, as I mentioned to you earlier, I started teaching feudalism, or which I knew nothing about it when I started teaching. So I evolved with it. I evolved with the teaching of feudalism. Uh, so we were also evolving, and students were also evolving. Students were excited, really excited, when they got so much of freedom to question their teachers in the class itself, and to counter their teachers' arguments in the class itself, which the teachers appreciated very greatly. So that it was an atmosphere of great liberation, as it were, in JNU, and the kinds of courses that we created, uh, laid the foundation for I suppose, for the expansion of these of the area of history, expansion of the area of study of history greatly. Something that I was mentioning earlier, new themes came up, new subjects were investigated, explored, new arguments came up, new perspectives came up. In the 1970s was the era of dominance of Marxism, not only in India but around the world. By the 80s, mid 80s, Marxism began to give way because it was socialist regimes were sort of facing crises, Soviet Union and Cuba and so on, China, but also Marxism itself as a philosophical system, or as a system of historical study, was facing severe questions. So this gave way to still newer themes and newer perspectives, which Marxism was not fully equipped to deal with. The questions of ecology, for example. The question: how do you write the history of a river from a Marxist perspective, or how do you write the history of the relationship within the family in a household, from a Marxist perspective, so that new ideas, new themes, new perspectives developed. Probably the trigger was, I could probably say, claim the trigger was the courses that we formulated. It was the kind of change that we wanted to bring about in Delhi University. Couldn't. So it was that change which was waiting to happen. It was that change which was there in the air. It was that change which was waiting to happen. We became the instruments of that change in a way, and therefore, as you mentioned, it really brought about a great deal of influence on the discipline of history writing in India, in all universities, most universities.
Ah, okay. So continuing along you know, the same line of
Okay.
Center for Historic Study and JNU specifically, I also had to ask that since you have been associated with JNU for so long, and so that you have been one of the most prominent academics there, do you have a comment on the recent changes that have been brought about, and not only in JNU for that matter, even in DU, the ad hoc displacement, the NEP, and the internal marking scheme, all of these changes. Uh, do you have a comment on what
Yes, of
all of
course,
this
yes.
entails?
Of course, yes. I mean, you see, what we were doing as teachers and professional historians and so on was to elaborate the uh, contours of the evolving contours of the discipline of history. But every discipline has certain norms to follow. History also has certain norms. The norms are: what is the evidence that you have for your statement? What kind of evidence is it? How reliable? How do you evaluate that evidence? Where does it stand scrutiny? Does your evidence, the volume of evidence and the quality of your evidence that you are relying upon for your argument, does it stand scrutiny, and so on and so forth. And then what is the logical or rational conclusion you are drawing from your evidence and from your exploration and so on. The discipline of history is basically this much. Is history is not a very technical discipline, and there have been some excellent historians who have not studied history as students, but they have mastered the discipline. So it's possible to master. It's not like physics or chemistry, which you can do at home, and so history can be mastered, but then you have to master the norms of the discipline. Whether you do it in a university, or at home, or wherever, or any institution. But what is happening today is, all the expansion that has taken place, all the vast development, evolution of the discipline that has taken place, of which I've talked so much already, that is being thrown back into where we all began, as it were. Where did we all begin? We began really the history that is studied around the world, almost around the world, uh, it evolved really in the 19th century. It took shape, fully developed shape it was evolving earlier, but it took fully developed shape only in the 19th century, when history became a positivist science. Positivist science in the sense that uh, it is based on, positivism came to social sciences from the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, your data is given to you. Uh, the nature gives you the data, whether it is physics or it is chemistry or it is space science or it is whatever. The data is given to you. If you are studying astrophysics, for example, the data about all the planets and stars and everything is given to you. You can't change that data. You can't even change that little data of the earth being round. You can't flatten it and make it flat. You can't change that data. It is an objective data. Now, once the data is objectively given to you, it's an objective data which you can understand and use for your benefit, but you can't change it. Uh, Once that is given to you, what is left to you is to explore the understanding of that data, try to understand the full attributes of that data, and use it for, like you, if the earth is round, you use that knowledge of the roundness of the earth to navigate in a manner that we do, you see. Or if the moon is at that distance, it is at that distance. You design your spacecraft in with the kind of understanding that it will require such speed and such energy and such so many days and so many weeks and so many days and so many hours and so many seconds to go and land there. You can't make a mistake there. So there is an objective reality which is given to you by nature, and there is a subjective understanding of that reality which keeps growing, as knowledge grows, incrementally grows. And ultimately that subjective knowledge coincides with that objective reality. It's then that you can change that, you can use that knowledge fully. Now, from this, so the notion of objectivity was given to us by the objectivity of knowledge, objectivity of the phenomenon that you are studying. Uh, that is given to us by sciences, and knowledge also becomes objective as it approximates to the reality, to the objective reality. Knowledge also becomes objective, just as our knowledge of the distance between earth and moon is an objective knowledge. There can't be any doubts about it, you see. So the distance is an objective reality, but the knowledge of that distance is also an objective reality. It has become an objective reality. It wasn't always so. It has become an objective reality, right? Now, from this understanding of natural sciences, it devolved to social sciences as well. The term social science, first it was used as singular, then it was used as plural. Social sciences came into use early in the 20th century. It's not very old. Uh, what did social sciences have in common with the natural sciences? The methodology was the same. Namely, the social sciences also assume that there is an objective reality out there which you need to explore, and through incremental knowledge, your subjective understanding or your subjective knowledge uh, will approximate to that objective reality, and then it will also become objective. So economics is a science, politics is political science, sociology is social science. History also become, there are still many organizations called, in France, the degree in history is given in science. uh, there are many organizations, world organizations, organization of historical sciences, congress of historical sciences or something. So the notion of science has devolved from the natural sciences to the social sciences, including history. Now, how does it evolve to history? It evolves in the sense, on the assumption that historical data is an objective data. Just as natural data is an objective data, historical data out there in the archives is also an objective data. And therefore, all the historian has to do is to go to that to the archives, collect that objective data, which he can't change. Just as a scientist can't change he can use but can't change the objective reality, historian can't change the data. So he will use that objective reality and come to an understanding of history as an objective reality, yeah, not merely a subjective perception, which may be wrong, but objective reality. This was put very succinctly by Leopold von Ranke, German thinker and historian, in the third quarter of the 20th century, third decade of the 20th century. When he put it, he defined history as history tells us as it really happened. As it really happened. The emphasis is on really happened. So you are able to, how do you know as it really happened? You will be able to reconstruct as it really happened from your archival data, and you will be able to reach an objective reconstruction of that reality through this archival data, through this incremental knowledge about what really happened. And you'll be able to come to the same kind of objective conclusion as a natural scientist does in physics or chemistry or wherever. So that the history also was an objective science. It became an objective science on the same principles as natural science. Uh, uh, Ranke's prescription was historians should go on collecting data. Their job is to collect data, not to judge the data, not to interpret it, not to draw any conclusions from the data, but to collect the data. And one day, all data would have been collected. Then history will tell you as it really happened. Then history will speak in unambiguous language, just as science does in unambiguous language. So history will also speak in unambiguous language, objective language. And he said it in 1824 and 1896, I think. Lord Acton, another great positivist thinker and historian, he said he pronounced that nearly all data has been collected. So that give another 10 or 20 years and all the data of history would have been collected, and then history will speak in unambiguous language, in the same say as natural sciences do. Now, there is a fundamental flaw in this argument, in this perspective. Fundamental flaw is that the natural data, the data of nature, natural sciences, is immune to any intervention by human beings. You can't change it in any way, right? And therefore, you can only understand it. The data about social sciences, any social science, and social sciences and humanities like literature or philosophy and so on, it is created by human beings. When you are studying the history of wars and battles, for example, you are studying the history of battles fought by human beings, some human beings against other human beings. These wars are created by human beings. The record of these wars has been written by other human beings who put in their own sort of understanding of these wars. Each side understood the each battle differently in opposites. So there were two sides to every battle, two sides of the story of every battle, at least two. And then at the third level, the historians today will be using that data which has been recorded by a human being who has recorded the data about another human beings, who had fought the battle. So the third human being, like you and us, you and me, who would be using this data, would be still developing still another understanding of that data, you see. So at every level, the nature of data changes. It doesn't remain objective. There is not the assumption that Ranke had made that history tells you as really happened. That means history has only one language. It will tell when it tells you as it really happened. What really happened can only be told in one language, in one manner. It can't be different versions of what really happened. So what really happened was based upon this notion of objectivity of single language of history. But history doesn't speak in one language because, as I said, I gave you three examples. At three levels, the each human beings have intervened in the creation of your data. You see, and then not all the data has is there in the archives. In any case, archives have very limited kind of data, about the elites, their wars, their families, their battles, their preferences, their fashions, and so on and so forth. But archives don't have data about how the laborer is working in the field, and how an ordinary human being is running his family with what economy. What is the economy of the family of a daily worker, for example? It doesn't have that kind of data. Oh, it doesn't have many kinds of data. It doesn't have data about the social values that are incorporated, that are socialized. Uh, Children are socialized into social values almost from the day they are born. Boys have to do this and girls have to do this, and boys have to be children have to be humble before their parents, and their social values are being incorporated. They are not there in the records. They are socially created, socially generated. And so on and so forth. So anthropologists know it better than historians don't know it. So that history has no one objective history is not one objective reality, and history doesn't speak to you in one language. It speaks to you in many languages. How does it speak to you in many languages? It speaks to you with what perspective with which you approach history. you know well, do you approach history with the approach of religion, for example? Or do you approach history with the approach of class interest, for example? Or do you approach history with the interest of culture, or uh, or the a kind of masculinity or femininity, or what? I mean, what is the perspective with which any three of you are sitting here. When you are given one topic by your teacher to write, three of you will study the same sources and yet write three different kinds of essays, because your perspectives will be different, your understanding will be different. So that it's not as if one is wrong and the other is right, unless you distort, and that's different. So it's that history is so dependent. History or all social sciences and humanities so dependent upon the perspective with which you try to uh, understand. Now, come to the main question. What has happened today is that history had developed like this for a long time, and it was changing for a long time. It has been changing for over a century, more than a century, century and a quarter, certainly. It has been changing from this notion of history as an objective science or objective reality. It has been changing to many kinds of histories and many perspectives and so on and so forth. Now, the kind of history that was brought to us that we studied, by we, I mean, not my generation or your generation, but Indian historians as a whole, is the kind of 19th century Rankian kind of history, objective reality. That's the kind of history that was taught around the world anyway. That was what was being taught, and therefore. What was that history? That history was brought to us by James Mill uh, in 1818 when he divided Indian history into the famous division Hindu period, Muslim period, British period. The implication of it was that in the Hindu period, Hinduism was the sole driving force of history. In the Muslim period, Islam, the ruling dynasty's religion, is the sole driving force of history. That's the only thing which brings about changes in history. It is a British. He was a utilitarian. He had very great contempt for religions, all religions, including Islam, and even more so Hinduism. He had contempt for Hinduism. He is, as a utilitarian, it was his assumption that uh, uh, it's a kind of legitimation of British rule. 19th century was full of these comments about West and East. East is the Orient and the Occident. Occident, the West is moving. It has a linear concept of time, in straight like an arrow. It moves forward. And therefore history has been a constant movement towards forward, towards progressive, towards progress. The idea of progress was very important in the idea of linear progress. Straight linear progress was. Orient, on the other hand, was believed to have circular time, cyclical time. It never moves forward. It keeps moving on its own axis, but doesn't move forward. So history in the Orient is static, backward, unmoving, unprogressive, and that was the division. Everybody accepted. Hegel accepted it. Karl Marx accepted it. All of them, Montesquieu accepted it. They said, Montesquieu said, even the dress hasn't changed for the last 1,000 years. The Indians are wearing the same dress today as they wore 1,000 years ago. Uh, uh, and so on. So everything was static. So this static East and progressive West, this was the notion this was the assumption from which James Mill had brought to India. India had been static so far because it was moved by religion, Hinduism and Islam. Now the British have unshackled India from these bounds of religion and put it on the way to progress, secular, modern, progressive state like the British state. So it was a legitimation of the colonialism. The British are almost performing a duty to society by ruling over it and by getting rid of these religious states, particularly the oppressive Muslim state and so on. So that this is what had brought this is the kind of history from 1818 to 1950s, actually 19 even 60s. This is the kind of history. Even the nomenclature was the same. Ancient history, ancient, medieval, modern was first used in 1903. Prior to that, it was same Hindu period, Muslim period, British period. And even when it became ancient, medieval, and modern, the basis remained the same. Ancient means right up to Harsha. Then there was a no man's land for a century or two. Then came the Muslims, and medieval began. Then came the British. The modern began. and so on and so forth. So nomenclature changed, but the basis remained the same. So that was the kind of history that we had begun with, and this is the kind of history that we have now developed into a vast arena of various kinds of themes and and dimensions of history and dimensions of the discipline and so on and so forth. Now, what is happening today is we are being pushed back to, we are being asked to forget all about all this ecology and forests and dress codes and history of you know concepts of time and space and household and interpersonal relations and philosophy. Just forget about them. History is a Muslim rule over the Hindus. That is what we are. So it's really a political project, essentially a political project, which is being substantiated by a resort to history, a kind of history that we have left behind about 60, 70 years ago. We have left that behind. But this is now being replaced. All the progress that we have made in the last 50, 60 years, the progress that we were talking about, all that has been pushed into the background. Just shut up, don't talk about it. Talk about how the Muslim state oppressed Hindus and how the Hindus bravely resisted. How the so there is nothing else left to be talked about in history than this Muslim oppression of Hindus. And even when there is no Muslim oppression of Hindus, or little of it, like in Akbar's case, forget about Akbar. Talk about Aurangzeb. You see, Aurangzeb is the. I often wonder if Dara Shikoh had succeeded Shah Jahan to the throne instead of Aurangzeb, what problems he would have created for our BJP. They won't have anybody to fall back upon. Aurangzeb is such a stable sort of source of their support today in the 21st century. But so what is happening today is really really abandoning all that great developments, evolution that has taken place in the discipline of history in India and elsewhere. And not only in history, in all disciplines. The great development, that evolution that has taken place, that has been being pushed back because the state needs to maintain a certain kind of order, social and political order, and therefore history can be distorted the way you want to. History, the history's progress can be forgotten. You go back to what James Mill had taught you, and that's all. That's the beginning and end of history. So I mean, but let me say that students like you and I, naturally as a teacher, I've been interacting with students and teachers and professional students and teachers of history. Uh, they are not taking this. They are not falling into this kind of distortions of history. They are sticking to, as you people are sticking to. It's a very encouraging example that you are setting. And you are not the only ones. Undergraduate students around in different colleges. I've spoken to them. All of us have spoken to them. Many of us have spoken to them. And the kind of publications they themselves are, in their undergraduate kind of magazines. Several of them have launched, at least two colleges of Delhi University. I think James, what's that? Jesus and Mary College students, and I think one more college, probably Deshbandhu College students. They launched their own magazines, edited by students and with contributions from students. And I've seen some of the essays written by students, very, very professional kind of essays. They are not taken in by this kind of, But the tragedy is that, professional historians will continue to, very unlikely that they'll go back to James Mill kind of history that they have given up uh, long ago. Very unlikely that they will go back. But, professional historians can, unless even that freedom is denied, at least in the near future, that freedom will remain to pursue your own interests. But what concerns the government is concerns the regime is not the government so much as the regime is the mind of how many of students who do their school 10 plus 12, how many of them will take to history as a discipline, maybe one third of 1%, or probably even 1/10 of 1%, or maybe one half of 1% of students of they'll go for professional history honors courses and so on. The rest of them will have read the history that is taught to them, James Mill kind of history that is taught to them, and that is their vote bank. You see, that is their stable source of support for their kind of history that they would be propagating. So it's a very well worked out strategy. See, forget about the integrity of the discipline of history. We need this kind of history, so we'll have it. We'll impose it on the people. And okay, if 1% of the students don't agree with us, 99% will still carry the kind of history that we have taught them. So, and they will be the source of support to them. So yeah, it's a very very serious situation. It's not very not something uh, to merely disagree and write it and be silent about it. This is something that is, but the result is that maybe you'll win the votes and you'll run the government, but what happens to society, which is being constantly put at war with one another, one section against another? What happens to that society? How will that society grow? Will it really grow at war with one another, or will it grow together at peace with one another, with peace at home and progress? That is what concerns people like me in my age. I have grown up in a different kind of India, uh, with a different kind of culture, different kind of understanding, different kind of knowledge of history, and different perspective on society. That is being um, threatened today, forcibly threatened today by this kind of imposition of this kind of history, and other disciplines also, but particularly history. Sorry for this very long-winded answer, but it required, because the issue is a huge issue, massive issue.
So it's a privilege to hear from you, and uh, it's indeed answers like this really make us feel as if we are in a class where uh, you're teaching us and talking to us.
Yeah.
It's The questions so far have covered history in the broader sense as well, and how it relates to the evolution of the discipline in the public. I would now like to move to a couple of questions that specifically pertain to interpretive frameworks within the field of history, since we live in times wherein there are several isms and paradigms that clash and so forth. So I have merged a couple of questions here because they are better when put together. So I was reading a work by R.C. Majumdar, who is often quoted by the right wing as someone who belongs to their faction. And there he cites Sir Charles Oman, wherein he says that, okay, history is not a logical and orderly development from cause to effect. And we find that, at least in my understanding, such a view negates social formations and evolutions and the sort of subject, the themes that we have been studying as undergraduate students. Upinder Singh, in her textbook as well, has criticized Marxism for its emphasis on unilinear models, something which he only discusses very cursorily and doesn't even delve into. On the other hand, we find Althusser and structuralism, something that Professor Harper discusses in a book, wherein the understanding is that sources are not, positivist texts. So there is a certain logic to how society works, but we find that, okay, these views have come under a lot of attack as well, and not just from votaries of the right wing, but historians in general, that there is a structure within which society operates and evolves, that there are meta narratives and meta structures like this. And I also find that, okay, Marxist humanism has perhaps not gained much ground in India. So, post neoliberal, or rather in a neoliberal era, how can we as students latch on to these varied strands, materialist strands, and or Marxist or Marxian strands in understanding history and all the debates around this?
Well, yeah, large question, very large question, interesting question, anyway, challenging question. Uh, Something that we have talked about, how history has changed from whether it is Rankian model of one objective history, or one single language history speaks one single truth, or Marxian kind of history, that the Marxian kind of history did bring in a lot of enlightenment, understanding, progress in the study of history on many aspects of history. Particularly the question of how societies change. Uh, and his emphasis was primarily, although it's contested, but nonetheless the emphasis was primarily that uh, it's the process of production, means and relations of production, which are the main driving force of change. When these means of production, ownership of the means of production, and relations with the means of production change, then other things also change. Not only economies change, but other things change. And he gave the example of how feudalism brings one kind of, feudalism brings one kind of thinking, capitalism brings quite another kind of philosophy, and so on and so forth. So that there is a kind of linearity in Marxism, that it's Marx is not the only one who thinks in terms of linearity, but he is a very influential. He means Marxism is very influential in terms of its linear kind of and almost determinist kind of thinking, namely economies change and therefore other things also change. So once all you need to do is to change the economy, and other things will also, philosophy, thinking will change, philosophy will change, politics will change, and so on and so forth. After Marx's death, uh, one Joseph Bloch uh, wrote a letter to Engels saying, you and Marx had emphasized only the economy in terms of historical explanation. Aren't there other facets of society which also influence change, like politics or like philosophy, etc.? So to which Engels wrote back saying that we emphasized, yes, you are right, Marx and I emphasized economy as the primary driver of change because it was being neglected by everybody else. So we wanted to bring it, uh, give it the primacy that it deserves. But there are other aspects as well. There is politics, there is society, there is social values, and so on and so forth. They also influence change. But having said that, but in the end, he says, it is the economy. In the last instance, these are his words. In the last instance, it is the economy which matters. So their emphasis. I was using the term Marx, but I meant Marxism as a whole, including Engels and others. Marxism as a whole was was a deterministic philosophy based on the economic determinism, by and large. You see, they would give some concession here and there, but by and large, this. Now, no one linear argument can explain all societal change. Societies change through many different ways. You see, one of the problems of this kind of explanation was that, once you have this, in the end, in the last instance, there is no last instance explanation of history. You already sort of stratify it. You have stratified the instances: first instance, second instance, and last instance, and so on and so forth. You have already given a fixed sort of space to each instance: uh, politics and society and culture and economy. You have it's a permanent structure of hierarchy of causes, as it were. That's what Marxism does. You see, this was questioned particularly by the Annales historians of France, who who gave an alternative kind of explanation, which was that there are no permanent hierarchical structures of causes of history. There are conjunctural causes. Each conjuncture of historical change has its own hierarchy of causes. Sometimes politics is much more important. Politics brings about change. Sometimes culture brings about change. Sometimes economy brings about change. Sometimes this, that, an incident, the killing of a particular leader brings about change. So there is no permanent hierarchy of causes, according to Annales historians. There is a there is a conjunctural hierarchy of causes, which depends on each conjuncture of historical explanation. So that a great degree of flexibility was brought into historical explanation by Annales historians. Now, I think so there is problem with any kind of deterministic kind of explanation, whether it is Marxism or earlier it used to be God's will. You see, in the medieval times in Europe, it was God's will which brought about every incident was caused by God's will. So God's will explained everything. There was no other explanation required. So you have to go into the complexities of each conjuncture of historical events. Uh, uh, my favorite example is the creation of Bangladesh. Bangladesh, East Pakistanis, Bengalis revolted against West Pakistan, not because of economic oppression, though there was economic oppression, not because of political oppression, though there was political oppression. I mean, they had they had a majority in the National Assembly or their parliament, but the government was formed by Punjabis, West Pakistanis, not East Pakistanis. So all of it was there. But in the end, what brought about the revolt of uh, East Pakistanis to create Bangladesh was the language, question of language. Their language was being suppressed, and they resented the suppression of language and therefore culture more than even the economic oppression and political oppression and so on and so forth. So in that conjuncture, language is the driving force of what happened in East Pakistan and led to the creation of Bangladesh, not the economy, not in the last instance the economy, as Engels would have put it. So yes, there are all of these perspectives have evolved. I gave you just one example for now. There are many others. There is postmodernism, which of course denies any kind of objectivity, any kind of history is like fiction. If you read Hayden White, history is just a imagination. It's just a construct. It's a construction by human beings. There is not, so that there are every kind of perspectives. Now, what how do you choose this perspective? See, one that these perspectives, uh, you don't necessarily have to go with one given perspective or the other given perspective. You don't have to stick yourself to one given perspective. But there are many different perspectives which explore and explain different facets of a phenomenon rather than just one. And secondly, that the rationality of your explanation is very important. You see, your explanation, whatever your perspective, it has to lead to rational conclusions rather than irrational conclusions. And one can see whether the conclusions are rationally drawn or irrationally drawn. That much one doesn't have to be partisan to see to see which is rational and which is irrational. One can see that the conclusions, different conclusions, are R.C. Majumdar was, you mentioned R.C. Majumdar, who was an excellent historian, professional historian, and therefore he stuck to the question of evidence quite. He wasn't really a, I mean, he was a right-wing historian, but a competent historian. Nonetheless, he wasn't really being irrational about his. One will disagree with a lot of things that he has said. One disagrees with a lot of things that many other historians have said. I have disagreed with almost everything that R.S. Sharma has said about feudalism. But both R.S. Sharma and I suppose, are rationalists, drawing rationalist conclusions, even if they are opposite to one another. So I think one has to distinguish between a, uh, whatever the perspective or whatever the different perspectives, one has to go, one, by the evidence, kind of nature of evidence, and b, whether the conclusions you are drawing are rational conclusions or irrational conclusions. Uh, that's the only judgment one can pass on any. Otherwise, every historian does write history differently, and their difference in writing doesn't make one historian rational. I mean, does make one can become very irrational. The kind of syllabus that is being imposed upon us is very irrational. But historians' differences are not irrational differences, not always irrational differences. They are differences of perspectives, and which is very important.
Thank
Yes.
you for this wonderful answer, sir. So before I hand over to Lokesh, I just was intrigued at the point about R.C. Majumdar. Right, despite being right wing, he was a competent historian, unlike
Yeah.
many who are put up by the present dispensation or the present lot. At the same time, I remember reading in a discussion that you partook in that even the progressive faction, even the left has often led to factionalism in many institutions, cults emerging and intolerance, especially around reputed and charismatic scholars. Now the right wing is pretty much taken over many institutions that's within their control, and are hell bent on destroying them. So for students who wish to come out of this, or at least a future beyond this, how do we foster academic and intellectual freedom on both the left and the right?
Fabulous question. Yes. And unfortunately, I do have to agree with you that, factionalism is not merely an attribute of the right wing. There is factionalism all over, you see, including in the left. Uh, and it has, uh, I only hope that what I'm going to say is not one sentence picked out from the whole discussion. No, no, I'm not saying you will pick it out, but anybody else could pick it out and say, look, even Professor Mukhia talks about factionalism of the left and so on and so forth. But yes, it is nonetheless true that there is factionalism everywhere, and very often led by charismatic scholars, very outstanding scholars. Now, what you can do is, on one hand, you are charmed by a charismatic scholar, as I was by my guru, Dr. Ashraf. Uh, uh, but you are charmed by the scholarship of very, very outstanding scholars, many of them. On the other hand, if you lose your critical faculty because of the fact that you are charmed by that eminent scholar, then that charm, becomes a part of the factionalism. You see, that's so. I think the only guarantee that we have, only possible guarantee that we can have of is uh, respect the greatness of the scholar that you admire, but do so critically. Don't give up your critical evaluation of the scholarship of that great scholar, very great scholar, like whether it is R.C. Majumdar or R.S. Sharma or Irfan Habib or Bipin Chandra or Romila Thapar or anybody else. Don't give up your critical evaluation of, and critical evaluation doesn't mean denunciatory. The more you denounce a great scholar, the more you establish your stature as a scholar. No, not that. Critical evaluation is critical evaluation. You have evaluated in terms of the evidence, the argument, and so on and so forth. That is, you don't give up that part of your discipline in order to. But the life is still very complex, and there are factions, and factions are promoted in every what's corner, let me say, left and right and center. And there are also very eminent scholars who did not promote any factionalism. They did not create a faction of their own. There are also such scholars. I naturally wouldn't like to name one kind or another kind, but there are scholars who did not create factions around themselves. Well, that's the only guarantee one can think of. Be critical, even of the scholars, uh, critical of the scholarship of even great scholars that you otherwise admire. You may admire them in many different ways, but including their scholarship, but remain critical of it rather than, and be aware that there is possibility of factionalism is for many reasons. You you get patronage through factionalism. You distribute patronage, and people get patronage, get appointments here and there, get favors here and there, patronage. Factionalism, whether in politics or in academics or in the doctor's profession or artist's profession, everywhere factionalism is a part of life, unfortunately. and yet the only way we can preserve our integrity to remain critical, including of factionalism, not to shut our eyes to the factionalism of our favorite scholars.
Good evening, sir. And this will be the final question for the day, and in many respects, a question asserting the path for a nation. In American history, there is a consensus school of historiography that tries to put emphasis on attempts at reconciliation rather than conflicts and oppression. We find such attempts even in a national movement after independence, while a consensus view was expressed in pieces such as Communalism and the Writing of History, written by Professor Thapar, Professor Chandra, and you yourself.
Uh,
Later emphasis has been put on structures and processes of operation that were hitherto neglected, such as on the grounds of caste and class. And between these extremes, what place can a consensus view of history, especially on the lines of nationalists like Pandit Nehru, occupy? And we are trying to reclaim a secular view of India, which is in a great part linked with teleological narrative of history.
ah, Well, yes, it's true that history was looked upon as communal and secular history or nationalist history. This was looked upon as communal and secular or nationalist history very largely because that's how the freedom struggle was divided. The freedom struggle had the one wing which was nationalist wing led by the Congress. The other was the communal wing led, the so-called nationalist wing and the so-called communal wing led by the Muslim League. Uh, you know, and they empirically, historically, they fought it out with each other and led to partition and so on. We all know that. But, in a way, these are the communalism and nationalism. They were given to us as binaries. You see, either you have one or the other. You are communal or nationalist. But were they really binaries? Uh, the what did nationalism propagate? That India consists of many religious communities. Each religious community has its own culture and its own religion and its own rituals and so on and so forth. But Congress has space for all of them. Congress will preserve the religious and cultural identity of each one of the communities uh, after independence, once India becomes independence, so that in India we can all live together without any conflict on the basis of religion. So assurance was given really of the preservation, sanctity and preservation of the religious identity of each community, religious practices of each community, and so on and so forth. That was the assurance. That is what uh, comprised nationalism. Nationalism of different communities living together. Hindu, Muslim, Bhai Bhai was the popular slogan. That is nationalism. Communalism, on the other hand, is the exclusive concern with one religion's community, uh, which is seen as in conflict with other religious communities because the differences are so large, so huge. Everything about as Jinnah and as Savarkar first and Jinnah later on saw uh, the differences, cultural differences, religious differences, social differences between the Hindus and Muslims are so irreconcilable that they cannot really live together. They cannot really form one nation, and therefore it led to the two-nation theory. But what is the basis of analysis? What is the category with which you are analyzing Indian society? Community. Both the Congress is analyzing Indian society in terms of communities. It's merely saying that communities all must live together. And the other rival side empirically rival side is really saying that we are a community. Their category of analysis is also religion, religious community. So, but we cannot live together because we are so different and so on. So that the analytical category for both Congress and the Muslim League was the same, namely religious category, religious community as the analytical category with which they mobilize their following. Both the Congress and the Muslim League mobilize their followings on the basis of religious community identities as the mobilizing category. Uh, Now, you see, the problem with this is that they don't constitute each other's alternative. Once you have religious community as the analytical category, then you can either have all communities living together, as Congress says, or communities not able to live together, as Muslim League says. That's about the only choice you have. You there is no they are not posing. They are not alternatives. They are not. They are empirically alternatives to each other, but conceptually they are not alternatives to each other. Conceptually they have much in common. And therefore the Congress lost the battle because once you have community, religious community as the organizing principle or category of analysis, then one communal riot here, there minor communal riot there, and the communities as they get divided today, they got divided then. So it's so easy to divide the communities with one communal riot. So Congress wasn't posing a conceptual alternative to the Muslim League. It was posing merely an a, a, a empirical alternative, but not a conceptual alternative to the Congress. And therefore, it did not really, the battle was in a way a losing ground, a losing battle right from the beginning. And there was no other, Communist Party was too weak to pose an alternative. And then, of course, there are others, RSS and so on and so forth, Savarkar and RSS and Hindu Mahasabha and so on and so forth. They were all there. So that the problem of freedom struggle gets, I think, greatly complicated I mean, we have all studied freedom struggle in terms of these binaries, Congress versus Muslim League, communalism versus nationalism. But I think if we study it slightly from a different angle, probably the answer would be very, very different from what we have got is empirically the division of India has taken place. That can't be undone, and nobody is trying to undo it. But the understanding will be very different. And your question about what was the second part of your question? Can you? What was the second part of your
Just a
question?
second, sir.
Yeah.
So, sir, it was like in between these extremes, what place can a consensus view of history,
Oh, yeah,
especially on the
consensus.
lines?
Yes, your
Yeah, yeah.
consensus. Yes, yes, yeah. That was the second part. Well, there was a consensus until now, until recently, by and large. I mean, after the partition, that is, there was a consensus on Nehruvian kind of secularism that had worked for about for 50 years, odd years. Today, that consensus is breaking down because it is being forcibly broken down. Because this consensus doesn't doesn't agree with the politics of the present regime. So they will, but history is a very long-term process. History has changed. If and countries, if India can survive the trauma of partition of 1947, it will survive this kind of trauma as well. This is essentially a political phenomenon that is taking place. It is also percolating down to society. That is the attempt of the regime, a regime which has, it's not merely Modi's regime one is talking of. One is talking of a regime which has worked for about 100 years now. RSS has worked for about, on the ground level, for 100 years now, preparing the ground for this kind of regime, and therefore it's going to live quite for some time, and particularly helped by the state power. But state powers keep changing, and India is not the only society. This regime is not the only society which is trying to mold history. Many other societies, Soviet Union did the same, Soviet Union created horrendous kinds of so-called Marxist histories. They were bad Marxism. They were very poor replicas of Marxist. In fact, Marxism was much more alive in the West than it was in the Soviet Union. But they out the history. They couldn't destroy history. The regime died out before history was destroyed. China is doing the same thing with its history. It's distorting history in different ways. But you know, as I mentioned earlier, that students of history, professional students of history, and teachers of history and researchers of history, they are sticking to the integrity of the discipline, and therefore I am sure that when the regime changes, it will change. It's not as if it's going to be a regime, permanent regime. So history will survive all these assaults. I'm not just being optimistic, forcibly optimistic, but I think, as I said, many other regimes have, in different countries, have sought to distort their histories, and yet regimes had to give way. History still survived. I hope it will survive here as well.
Thank you so much for your time, and to everyone who will be watching this interview once it's uploaded or reading its transcript. I would only like to make one clarification that Professor Mukhia's modesty comes from a place of great eminence, and anyone who has even a cursory encounters with history, right from the early medieval to medieval and historiography and the conceptualization of history. Um, and I hope people will be inspired to check out history more deeply after watching or reading this interview. That they'll get to appreciate Professor Mukhia, and I'm grateful to the probe and to Caucus for giving me this opportunity, for my fellow interviewers, and of course to Professor Mukhia for giving us his time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much.